Our presenter for today is Gary Gleason. He's Vice President of Nusura, and he's worked in public transportation since 1990 and emergency management since 1998. Mr. Gleason is an expert in emergency planning, training, and exercises for transit agencies and departments of transportation. He's worked for Regional Transportation Authority as well as FEMA. In fact, he helped write FEMA's crisis communications plan for the 2002 Olympic Games in Salt Lake City. Gary is a co-principal investigator on the Transportation Research Board's project studying the role of paratransit in emergency situations, and is an adjunct professor with the U.S. Department of Transportation's Transportation Safety Institute. He has provided training and or technical assistance in nearly every state in the U.S. and several countries abroad. Gary Gleason is our presenter. Gary?
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks for Frank for kicking this off. Thank you, everyone on the call, for joining us today. I guess I'd like to start by saying hello to all those people who I've met already. Looking down the list, there are a lot of familiar names, and those who I haven't met before, it's a pleasure to do so. We're going to be spending about 45 minutes or so on this webinar. This is not the delivery of emergency procedures for rural transit drivers per se, but rather an overview of what's included in this training module. The training module, we're going to show you all the pieces and parts that are in there, so you can understand what the 3 units are within the training module and have a real sense of the kind of support that it gives you as a transit driver or as a transit trainer to be able to help drivers do the best job they possibly can when faced with an emergency situation. Very important topic in a short amount of time that we have to cover this. So I'd ask you, if you can, if you have an office door, go ahead and close that. Shut down your email program, shut down your instant messaging program. I know from personally attending webinars myself that all those things tend to keep you distracted and away from the topic at hand, and it is such a short period of time we have to talk about, and such a very important topic. I'd ask you to do that. Do please ask your questions as we go along so we can field those at the end. And I guess with that, we'll jump into our training overview here for emergency procedures for rural transit drivers from the National Rural Transit Assistance Program. So what are we going to talk about here today? First of all, we want to talk a little bit about the RTAP Safety and Security suite of products, all the things that National RTAP has developed that can help managers make better decisions about risk management and drivers do a better job of responding to emergency situations. We're going to give you an overview of this particular training module, Emergency Procedures for Rural Transit Drivers. We're going to give you a brief recap on some of the instructor materials, and there's a pretty nice suite of things that we have in this training product for you to be able to roll that out. We'll talk about how it is you go about getting your hands on these training materials. Obviously, safety and security has been an important piece for our industry and for the National RTAP program for a lot of years. I want to talk about several training programs in this suite of products in the emergency management and safety security arena from National RTAP. The first of those, and these 3 that are listed on your page, are really specifically focused on drivers. So Safety Training in Rural Transit, or START, this was updated and released just a couple of years ago from National RTAP, and really focuses on 3 things: vehicle, driver, and passenger safety. So how, as a driver, do you do your job safely on a day-to-day basis? The next of these is Problem Passengers, Challenging Situations, which is a new module talking about how do we work with our customers so that different people, because we're all a little bit different, don't become dangerous. And it's a great resource to be able to help drivers really understand how to manage the customer more effectively to keep things from getting worse than they might otherwise. The module that we're going to talk about today, Emergency Procedures for Rural Transit Drivers, talks about not how you manage things on a day-to-day basis in terms of general safety and security, but rather, if things go wrong, how do you respond more effectively? A couple of other products in this suite from National RTAP that you may want to consider if you don't have them on your list are the Threat and Vulnerability Toolbox and Risk Management for Rural Transit Managers. Those are more focused on what the transit manager needs to do in identifying hazards and threats, and managing those risks, but other pieces that are very important to the overall emergency program for each of you who are on this call with us today. So this training module, Emergency Procedures for Rural Transit Drivers, what's in this thing? There's really 3 units within that: preparedness, hazards and threats, and emergency procedures. So preparedness is about how do you make sure that you as a driver and your vehicle are prepared to be able to respond appropriately to emergency situations. The second chapter or second unit, hazards and threats, just briefly identifies here are the things that can go wrong. So you have that in your head as a driver, go, okay, I know what some of my threats, some of my hazards, the risks that I face may be. And then the third unit within this training module, emergency procedures, really walks you through step by step what you do to each of the likely hazards and threats that you may face. Within each of these units, there are exercises or case studies that as a trainer you can walk your participants through. Even if you're doing it as a self-paced e-learning type of environment, they help you to think through some of the problems that you may face out there on the road. And there's also quizzes. These quizzes help recap what are the most important elements of each of the units within this overall training module. So what do you learn if you've participated in this course? Again, we're doing an overview of what's in the course, but it gives you an idea of why you would want to use this training module for your staff. First of all, it helps you identify what are some of the common hazards and threats that you face as a driver. Anyone who takes this course should be able to talk about the different kinds of training, not just emergency procedures, but also START and other kinds of training that they should receive as a driver. This course, by the end of it, participants should be able to identify what is the required onboard emergency equipment and what are some of the recommended pieces of onboard emergency equipment. It'll help you explain the connectivity between personal lifestyle and your role in public safety. And frankly, in transit, we do have a role in public safety, and I think we're coming to that realization more and more as an industry. And lastly, and this is the important one, people who participate in this course, particularly if you do a lot of good work with the hands-on piece of this training, should be able to demonstrate with great efficacy the standard procedures that they should follow in an emergency situation. So what I want to do now is just quickly, and we're going to do this very quickly because we're trying to move through the entire training program and give you a sense of the breadth of this training program, each of the 3 units so you can understand what's in there. So this unit talks about introduction to the concept overall. What are the driver training requirements? How do you make sure your vehicle is ready to go out on the road? And then how do you make sure that you as a driver are really prepared for your job in a day-to-day operation, but also particularly responding to emergency situations? A lot of things that drivers need. This emergency procedures for rural transit drivers is a big part of it. START is another one, so safety, working with customers effectively, all very important. Also, as you think about this as trainers, how do you utilize this module? You want to think about integrating it with your existing agency policies and procedures. Every transit system does things just a little bit differently, and you need to be able to incorporate those concepts into your overall training program, along with, as I said, defensive driving, proper use of the vehicle, customer service, and those other pieces. Down at the bottom, other emergency response training pieces you may want to think about are, first of all, the National Incident Management System and the Incident Command System, NIMS and ICS. By presidential directive, every transit agency should be providing this sort of training for their staff, and there are free online courses for that. And of course, many transit systems ask their drivers to also do CPR, first aid. Again, that varies from agency to agency based upon risk management strategies. So as a driver, when you think about vehicle readiness, there's a lot of things that you think about in terms of vehicle readiness, but in the sense of emergency procedures, we think it's very important that drivers have a good sense of how do you do the pre-trip from a perspective of emergency management, not just in terms of safety issues, but how do you identify signs of tampering, vandalism, other things of that nature. Looking for that damage, looking for damage to the vehicle itself, and ensuring that you have those 5 required items for safety, being the fire extinguisher, first aid kit, biohazard kit, web cutter, and triangles or flares. During the travel over the course of the day, it's important that drivers understand to look, listen, smell, and feel. So how do you do a good job of watching for things, and by watching carefully, being able to keep things from happening or make them not as bad if they do. And then obviously that post-trip inspection piece, making sure that everything is off the vehicle, people are out of the vehicle, that there hasn't been left packages, whether it's a suspicious package or just things left behind. These are all important considerations in terms of vehicle readiness for any sort of emergency situation. Personal preparedness, however, is perhaps paramount to proper emergency response. So this training module in Unit 1 talks about mental preparation. How do you as a driver do a better job of relaxing and anticipating the kinds of things that may come your way? We talk a little bit in this unit around health risks such as smoking and exercise and drug and alcohol use and stress, and how do you manage those so you're in the best possible space in terms of mind, body, and spirit to respond to emergency situations. And we include exercises, in fact, one that focuses specifically on how can you as a driver reduce your fatigue and reduce your stress overall, and what kind of steps might you take to improve your health and nutrition so you can be in the best possible position to respond quickly, decisively, and effectively to save lives and property when you're faced with an emergency situation. We also encourage you and provide good guidance in the instructor's guide for this training module about how you might do some orientation for your drivers on board. So actually bringing them out to your vehicles and talking about what is the essential emergency equipment. Where are the emergency exits and how do you operate them? How do you properly operate the wheelchair lift and do wheelchair securement or mobility device securement both with and without power on your vehicle? We think it's very important that drivers have the opportunity to practice using web cutters, so if they need to cut themselves out of their seat belt if the vehicle were on its side or something like this, or quickly free a customer who is restrained in their mobility device. And doing some practice, there's some good guidance about how you do that practice, and thinking about drag and carry techniques, so if you do have to evacuate your vehicle, you can do it. It's harder than you might think, and we recommend and provide some guidance in this training module about how you do that sort of training on board your vehicle. Within each chapter in this unit, as I mentioned, there are quizzes. Frankly, these quizzes are not terribly difficult. In fact, you might be able to go to them, take the quiz, and actually pass. Rather, these quizzes give drivers the opportunity to really identify, okay, what are the most important lessons learned out of this particular chapter? So in the case of this first unit, being fit for duty includes what sort of things, really being ready in mind, body, and spirit. Why do you do the pre-trip inspection? What are the 5 life safety items that must be on your vehicle? Most important safety tool, of course, your brain. How do you look for signs of tampering? Things that we want to make sure that the drivers pull out of this first unit. In Unit 2 of this training module, we talk about the hazards and threats that drivers may face. And we don't talk in this unit about how you respond to them, but rather just giving drivers a sense of what they face so they can be better prepared if something does go wrong. And this includes the 6 categories here, accidents and incidents, obviously the grist of the mill in terms of safety on our transit systems. Acts of nature, be it fire, flood, hurricane, tornado, whatever the case may be, hazardous materials, criminal activity, terrorism, and loss of critical infrastructure like power and such. So within each of these, we provide some sort of breakdown, if you will, where you can talk with your students if you're doing it in a classroom type environment, or in our e-learning environment. It leads the students through this key content, content that's in the learner's guide and obviously reflected here in the PowerPoint presentation around slips and falls and those sorts of things, onboard medical emergencies, vehicle breakdown, the very dangerous issue that we face in transit of potentially an onboard fire, all these types of things that might go wrong and are really probably the most high probability, high impact risks that we face as a transit industry. We talk in here about acts of nature, and that's everything from fires and floods and so forth, but this top one on this list, darkness, is a very important one, I think, particularly as we look at our aging population. Our drivers are aging as well. As we get older, our visual recovery time, that is how long it takes for our eyes to readjust to the dark after we've been blinded by lights and that sort of thing, changes as we get older. Blood pressure, something that many of us face as we get older, also affects that. And of course, those of us with diabetes face concerns with our visual recovery time. So talking about darkness is very important, as well as the particular active nature risks that you face in your own community. There are a lot of hazardous materials out there on our rail lines, out there on our roadways. Some of those are placarded, as this placard would indicate of the types of hazardous materials that may be on board. There are also hazardous materials that are being transported illegally. We know that it's true. We don't know necessarily what they are. But we think it's important that transit drivers understand that A, there are hazardous materials out there, and B, how do you know that there's some sort of hazardous materials released? So in this chapter we provide some guidance around that, and essentially if you see multiple people exhibiting the same signs and symptoms, you have a high probability of a toxic chemical release. You may see things like a cloud of mist, powder or dust. We saw that in the anthrax scare back in 2001. We just think that it's important that drivers understand that there's a lot of risks out there and how to recognize it so they can respond quickly to protect themselves and their passengers. In this unit, we talk about critical infrastructure being electricity that powers our stoplights and so forth, fuel, our telecommunication systems. We're very dependent upon these systems for the efficiency and the operations of our transportation systems, and it's important to identify for the drivers what the hazards are that we face with those. We talk in this unit about criminal activity, everything from minor events like vandalism or fare evasion, all the way to serious things such as assault, robbery, and so forth, helping drivers to understand what are the criminal elements that are out there that they may face as drivers, and helping them think about the difference then between criminal activity, which is for personal gain, and terrorism, which is really more political. The 5 prime tactics that are being used by terrorists, particularly in terms of transportation, include bombing, armed attack, kidnapping, arson, and assassination. How do you know that those are potential risks, or how do you recognize it? Certainly looking at different versus difficult versus dangerous passengers. We're all a little bit different. We all come from different backgrounds and have different values. We can move from different to difficult if drivers don't properly manage the situations. And it depends upon who the passengers are, what kind of passenger you're serving. But this training module, Emergency Procedures for Rail Transit Managers, helps drivers to understand that we're all a little bit different. Some passengers are difficult. And what are the warning signs when passengers move from difficult to dangerous? So that verbal agitation, given the stink eye, intense unbroken eye contact is referred to here, expletives, threats, these sorts of things. Helping drivers understand that transition from difficult to dangerous is very important to help ensure that everyone is, or our drivers rather, are doing the best job they can to manage situations. Within Unit 2, we have a couple of case studies that help drivers think about some of the key issues. This one is about trespassing. You're reporting to work, doing your pre-trip inspection, and as you're going out to do your pre-trip, you notice a couple people in the yard. They see you and quickly turn and walk away. What do you do with this? How this is handled is going to be different from one agency to the next, but we think it's very important to have this conversation with your drivers, which is why this is included in this overall training module. So does it trigger concern or not? What do you report and to whom do you report it? How does that change your approach to your pre-trip in terms of looking for vandalism or signs of tampering? And identifying, are there things that your agency can do to help increase safety and security overall? We also provide an opportunity in this training module to help our drivers practice giving descriptions. Our drivers may need to give descriptions of people for a lot of different reasons. Missing children, potential perpetrators, a wide variety of causes. One of the things that we find in safety and security is that practicing giving descriptions of people does a great deal in terms of helping improve your skills in doing that. So we're going to practice that right now. You're about to see a picture of 2 young men. It's going to be displayed for about 10 seconds. So Pay close attention to small details. So if you were delivering this module, you would then ask your participants, and I'm asking you to do this now, pull out a piece of paper and write down every detail you can remember about these two men. Spending a moment or two thinking about what they might have been wearing. How heavy are they? How tall are they? Other signs that if folks were out looking for these gents, what would they be looking for? One of the things that you'll find by going through this process is that doing some sort of composite sketch, if you will, actually results in a more accurate description. So working in small groups, first individually and then in small groups, drivers will learn, wow, those are some of the things I need to look at and think about for doing descriptions of individuals. So you can answer for yourself right now how you did with your description on these two. Practicing this will improve your skills at it dramatically. At the end of this unit, we have, of course, another quiz talking about, what causes most accidents, what is visual recovery time, what do you do, how do you recognize dangerous passengers, signs of toxic release. Again, those elements that are most important, we feel, out of this training module. The third unit within this training module is emergency procedures. So these are the step-by-step that you may want to take as a driver in response to any of those hazards and threats that you may face, be it accidents and incidents, acts of nature, loss of critical infrastructure, criminal activity, hazardous material spills, terrorism, trying to break it down into simple steps that drivers can follow regardless of what the hazard or threat may be, helps ensure a consistent and predictable response to emergency events. So what are those 7 steps? First of all, assessing the situation. Unless you can do a good job of what we call in the industry scene size up, you may not recognize the hazards and threats that are out there. So assessing the situation, deciding what you need to do, critically important. Secondly, notifying dispatch and asking for assistance. Obviously, we want that to happen soon in the process so aid can be on the way. In any sort of emergency situation, our priorities are protection of self, protection of others, protection of equipment, and protection of environment. So these are reflected in our 7 steps. Step number 3, protect yourself so that you're not becoming a bigger part of the problem. We don't want to trade a life for a life. Then protecting others, taking those steps to ensure that your passengers are being protected to the best degree you're able to. Then securing the vehicle, gathering the information about the incident, and providing those post-incident reports that are so very important to our response. So we provide good checklist guidance in binary, can I handle it myself or not? What sort of assistance do I need? Do I keep the vehicle where it is or move it? Those types of questions, so providing that flow chart. In this unit then, under accidents and incidents, we talk about as you assess the situation. How do you assess the situation? How do you identify what the other hazards and threats are? What sort of other pieces of information do you want to gather immediately in your scene size up so that you can report quickly and effectively to dispatch to ask for that sort of assistance? When you notify dispatch and request aid, what are you asking for? I think that dispatchers, the more information they can get quickly, the better job they're going to be able to do of getting emergency response personnel, be it transit agency personnel or traditional first responders, to the scene with the type of assistance that may be needed. Step 3, protecting yourself. How do you do that effectively? And how do you make sure that your passengers are protected and that they're given the proper information so that they understand what's going to happen next? One of the things that we always try to teach with all the drivers we work with is the notion that they are going to be the incident commander during an onboard emergency for those first minutes between when the emergency happens and when traditional first responders arrive on scene. And so providing this sort of guidance will help your drivers to be in the best position possible. Securing the vehicle, obviously very important. What are the steps in this? This is something we go through in just a day-to-day safety and important to re-emphasize that in the context of emergency procedures. And in this training module, we talk a little bit about how do you do proper securement of the vehicle in terms of use of your flares or triangles on a 2-lane road, on a divided highway with curves. And it's a great opportunity for discussion with your drivers so they can make the very best on-scene decisions possible to protect themselves, your passengers, and your equipment. Gathering information about the incident, whether it's courtesy cards for your customers, information about other drivers, what sort of questions to answer to first responders, what sort of questions not to answer with the media, for example. Very important guidance for your drivers in responding to any sort of accident incident using these 7 steps of emergency management. And then obviously completing post-incident reports and making sure your driving staff are familiar with your own agency's procedures for how you want incidents and accidents reported. Now these 7 steps can be used for any sort of emergency. There are some slight variations that you might find for mechanical breakdown, for bodily fluid spill, for an onboard medical emergency. And this training module provides some guidance on how those steps may vary slightly, but all staying within the 7 steps. We provide guidance under accidents and incidents about when and how you may want to evacuate your vehicle and what those procedures may be. Important when we think about evacuation to think about evacuating not just our ambulatory passengers, but also our non-ambulatory passengers. What order do you do that in? How do you do it if you don't have wheelchair lift? What are some of the drag and carry techniques? And again, these materials are included in the learner's guide for this training module. We talked then about the 7 steps for acts of nature. For hazardous material spills, be that a fuel-related incident or some sort of biological, neurological, or blister type of agent that may be out there. How do you recognize the signs and symptoms we talked about in Unit 2? And here then in Unit 3 we talk about what do you do if you see those signs and symptoms. We talk about critical infrastructure, so how do you as a driver make continuity of operations decisions? That is, do I continue my route or not, if you don't have communications with dispatch? Every agency should have policies on this. Some do, some don't. But this training module is a great opportunity for you to open that discussion with your drivers. Making sure your drivers understand how to respond to traffic lights that are not working, communication systems that are not working, use of the heating and ventilation within their vehicles. In terms of criminal activity, we talk about it in this training module from a couple different perspectives. One is how do you serve as the eyes and ears for your community? So watching for criminal activity that's going on out there in the community, and how do you properly report that up the chain of command? And also criminal activity that may happen on the vehicle itself, from dangerous passengers to violence to weapons or suggestion of weapons, even the possibility of a commandeered vehicle or hostage situation. Helping our drivers understand how to respond to those using the 7 steps of emergency management. Very, very important, and there's guidance in this training module around just how to do that. Terrorism, I think that we're coming to this realization that terrorism isn't just Al-Qaeda. In fact, if you look at the history of terrorism, most of it has been domestic terrorism from Timothy McVeigh and the bombing in Oklahoma City on in times past. So how do you know that there's potential for terrorism? This is sort of a be on the lookout or BOLO thing that our drivers need to understand. So watching for people who are surveilling, people who are gathering information, intentional breaches of security, other suspicious activity and behavior and so forth, suspicious credentials. What we find in terrorism is it tends not to be so much about any one particular thing, but rather does it look funny, feel funny, smell funny. Really following that combination of senses is what helps us to be prepared. And of course, on our transit vehicles, stuff gets left every day. Backpacks, briefcases, groceries, a wide variety of left items on our vehicle. How do you distinguish as a driver between something that somebody just forgot and left behind and something that could be dangerous? So in this training module, we'll provide some guidance around hot items, that is, things that are usual in unusual places, or unusual in very ordinary places. So the HOT test, hidden, obvious, or typical. We talk in this training module about improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and chemical, biological, and radiological risk. Frankly, I think the big concern for us in the industry right now is IEDs. There's an awful lot of them being used over in the Afghanistan and Iraq area. A lot of folks who are coming back who have been too close to some of those IEDs. And so I think that we have some concerns in our society with all of that now. In Unit 3, we have some case studies. This case study, first one is around an accident. So you're in your vehicle, talks about who you have on your vehicle. Some are ambulatory, some aren't. You're at a red light, smacked from behind and pushed into the intersection and struck by another vehicle, front door blocked, wheelchair lift blocked. What do you do? And what we ask our drivers to do through this training module is to, first of all, identify, doing that scene size up, what are the hazards and threats that you face? What are the challenges? What sort of action steps do you take using those 7 steps for emergency response? Putting those actions into priority order, identifying what resources you'll need, and then practicing calling dispatch, asking for that type of assistance. The more your drivers can walk through these types of assessments, the more quickly and effectively they're going to be able to respond when something goes wrong, in this case to an accident. We provide a case study around a hazardous material spill. In this case, you're driving along the highway, slow traffic, the rail that runs parallel to the highway, train crashes, you see smoke billowing from the record, there's a vapor beginning to collect in the low-lying areas, you're stuck in traffic. So what do? Again, using the 7 steps of emergency management, identifying what your hazards and threats are, identifying your action steps, putting them in priority order, and taking the steps that you need to request aid and protect yourself and your passengers. We have a case study in this unit within this training module around dangerous passengers, difficult or dangerous passengers. In this case, you have a driver gets on who's ranting and raving a bit, and you ask him to mellow out, but he won't. And look in your mirror, you have evidence of potentially a weapon. So how do you respond to that situation? Identifying, once again, your hazards and threats and your action steps and putting them in priority. And in this case, you may not be able to ask for aid right away. How do you do that? Some agencies have systems for that. Some do not. Guidance about this is provided in this training module. We then, of course, have the quiz at the end of this chapter, pulling out those areas that we feel were most important in some of the learning in here. So to review, the first unit within this chapter is about preparedness. How do we make sure that we as drivers are prepared, that we understand our own personal limitations as well as our capabilities, and that we put ourselves in the best position possible in terms of our emotional condition, physical condition, to be able to respond to emergency situations. We talk also about vehicle readiness and making sure we have all the onboard equipment there and ready to go. So we don't, for example, need the first aid, go to the first aid kit and find that it's been pilfered. In the second unit, we talk about what are the hazards and threats that drivers may face. And in this third unit that we were just talking about, what are the 7 steps to manage any sort of crisis and the protocols for those sort of probable incidents. So that's what's in the student materials, the learner's guide for this training overall, and you've seen most of the PowerPoint that goes along with that. I want to turn our attention during our remaining minutes here today to talk about the instructor's guide and other support materials in there. And I think this is a great suite of products. Again, you have the learner's guide, the instructor's guide, some videos, 4 videos in fact, one that's an overview of the training as a whole, and 3 videos, that one for each of the 3 units within the module. The PowerPoint that you've just seen, a DVD that includes all of those materials, and an e-learning disc so that if people don't have the luxury of a trainer or they want to use it as a refresher, you can just sit your driver down at a computer and have them go through a self-paced, self-learning piece. In this instructor's guide, we cover a few things that I think are really helpful. The first is training basics, so a little bit about adult learners. That adult learners, they have a lot of life experience and it's important to them to be heard. they tend to be more sensitive to their environments, making sure you have comfortable chairs and the right temperature in the room, making sure that it's interactive and that the driver or your student, if you will, are really, that you're invested in their learning. We talk in here about the notion of tell, show, do, and review. Tell, show, do, and review. So the notion is we tell the drivers, lecture to them about what the content is. We then show them or illustrate for them the skill that we want them to know how to do, and then give them the opportunity to do it for themselves, and review by talking about what they learned, what worked, and what didn't work. So a lot in there about training basics that we think are very helpful. We've provided in this instructor's guide some clear guidance on what sort of materials you're going to want available to you as a trainer in the room, what you want for each of the students, everything from the learner's guide to notepads and pens and name tags and such, visual aids you might want to have, how to properly set up the room, and those sorts of things. We talk in the instructor's guide about course design. How do you go about setting up a curriculum and adapting the curriculum that we've provided for you here in Emergency Procedures for Rural Transit Drivers to your own individual agency? So going through what materials are there, and then lesson plans. We think that lesson plans are very important, both in terms of your documentation of the training you provided in case, God forbid, something happens downstream, and in terms of just making sure that you deliver to your students the kind of training that you really find is most important. So within this instructor's guide, there are lesson plans for each of the 3 units. There are estimations of what we think you may want to allocate in time for each of those 3 units. Hour and a half for the first unit because there is so much hands-on work we recommend out in the vehicle. For identifying hazards and threats, you can probably cover that in 90 minutes. And then we suggest really spending a few hours on Unit 3, Emergency Procedures, so you can do a lot of work in discussion and a lot of hands-on guidance, if you will, to ensure that your drivers have all the skills that they need and have practiced them, and frankly can feel confident when they need to respond. Also included in the instructor's guide are some basic tools that are helpful, like the sign-in sheet, so you can demonstrate, if you need to, who was at this training. We have a course evaluation form in there. Certainly you could use your own, but there's one included in this trainer's guide so that you can get feedback about how to improve things, a certificate of completion for those drivers who participate, and additional resources. Pulled out in this also are the quizzes and the exercises, so you don't have to dig for those. So a lot of good support materials for you as an instructor. One of the things that we like about this training module is that it is modular, meaning that we have the DVD, the disc for self-paced learning, either for those of you who don't have a trainer or as refresher training. And then we have all the materials for an instructor-led course, which could be done in a single day-long session or spread out over a period of weeks or months as fits your schedule as part of, say, safety meetings and that sort of thing. These case studies that we provided can be used as what's identified here as a discussion-based exercise, sort of a tabletop exercise, or you could use it as a functional exercise and actually have folks go outside and practice it. And we recommend that, in fact, you start with discussion-based and then go out and practice in the vehicle itself. So with that, I guess I want to conclude with just a couple of thoughts. First of all, I know that we have a lot of people on the call, some 175 folks who are signed into it. I know that in some cases, individuals have gathered together into a single room to watch this. So you're going to be getting a survey in just a minute here. In this survey, you're going to be asked how many people are watching this webinar with you. Everything from 0, meaning you're watching it by yourself, to 4 or more. We have 5 choices. And if you could please go ahead and answer that for us, that would be very helpful in terms of our tracking. I also want to let you know that this training module will be delivered in greater depth at the Southwest Transit Association Conference in Austin on the 28th of this month. So anyone on the call here who's going to SWATA, you would have another opportunity to dig just a little bit deeper into this training module then. This webinar will be posted on the national RTAP.org website. That's nationalrtap.org. It'll be up in the next week or so. So if there are others who you know of it within your agency or other agencies who you're familiar with who may want to see this, that'll be available for you. So with that, I guess I'd like to open it up to questions, comments, and discussion from our audience.
Okay, Gary, this is Frank. Let me see. Let's look at our first question here. Are these training modules provided for group or individual training?
The answer is both group and individual training. That is, you could use that e-learning disc for self-paced individual training. You could use this training module to train one new driver who I just hired this week, or you could use it as a regular part of your training program to train all your drivers at once. I think it's going to vary from agency to agency based upon their own individual policies and based upon the size of the organization and just their capacity. But I guess the bottom line in my mind is make sure that your drivers understand what they need to do in terms of safety on a day-to-day basis. That material is covered pretty well in START. Make sure they know how to deal with difficult passengers because they come across them every day. And then making sure they understand how to respond appropriately, and whether you use emergency procedures or perhaps some other things that are out there. Giving our drivers those skills is, I think, one of the most important things that we can do in our jobs as transit managers or transit trainers.
Okay. Here's a couple related questions to each other. How can I order these products? I can answer that for them. If you send us an email, info@nationalrtap.org, give us your information, your ship-to address, and how many of these you want, and we'll be happy to package them and send them to you. There is no cost for these, for shipping or handling or anything. It's completely free. We've got another question that says, can I get 20 of these? Of course. Just tell us how many you need and we'll ship them to you. Another follow-up question, are there federal or other funding sources available to defray the cost of the training materials or other equipment recommended? There's no cost for this training. What about the equipment side of that, Gary?
Well, in terms of the equipment for that, one of the things that FTA is that the Federal Transit Administration has said is folks should be spending up to 1% of their capital on emergency management concerns, or providing some sort of justification about why they're not spending that 1%. So you can certainly use capital to do that, both in terms of training and in terms of the physical equipment itself. And so yeah, there's certainly those resources out there. And I guess if you have further questions about that, I'd talk to your state 5311 provider, or if there's 5310 folks on the call here today as well. So talk to your state DOT, your state RTAP coordinator, and get those systems in place.
For the material, do you need one per employee?
My recommendation is that every employee receive the learner's guide, that the instructor get the instructor's guide, and the DVD that has the videos on it. Again, there's 4 videos. One is an overview, and then one for each of the chapters, and so that really helps with that show piece of the tell, show, do, and review.
Do you have posters with the information for the 7 steps?
No, there's not a poster per se for the 7 steps. Certainly you could create a poster from the 7 steps out of the screen from the PowerPoint, and that might be a good way to go, as well as the flow chart that was provided in here that, again, it's provided right now as an 8.5 by 11 type of format in the learner's guide and the instructor's guide, and you could certainly blow that up to any size you might want to. And that would be a good kind of thing to keep in people's clipboards in their vehicles.
5 tools, triangles or flares. Are flares approved now for passenger vehicles?
The recommendation from DOT is that you use triangles, not flares. I know that there are transit systems out there that operate in areas where there's a lot of darkness. And by darkness, I don't mean up in Alaska, I mean fog and that sort of thing, fog and dust storms. So I know of transit systems out there that are still using flares because they feel like it's a safer approach for their particular operating environment. But the recommendation from the DOT, because of the fire hazard, is triangles.
Okay. Do you have to be certified to teach this program once we order it?
There's not a certification process, so no, there's not a certification process for this training. My recommendation for this is just to become very, very familiar, because one of the things we know about adult learners, they want to learn from experts. And so the more expert you can become in this material by reading this course forwards and backwards, and frankly by reading some of the other additional resources that are included on 18 in the instructor's guide, will help you be as prepared as possible to answer any questions that your students may have, and help your students, your drivers, have the sense of confidence that you're giving them the very latest and greatest based on lessons learned and industry best practices. And I guess the good news is that this emergency procedures module is based on just that.
What is the best practice for vehicle accident with emergency door and the wheelchair lift do not function? And do you have a wheelchair person in the van?
Evacuate your ambulatory passengers first. Utilize your strong and non-ambulatory your strong ambulatory passengers to help you as a driver. Don't try to take it all on by yourself. So some folks you may want to set on safety, so they're making sure that you don't have a secondary collision because they're watching out of other things that are going on around the area. Have those able-bodied passengers help you with the evacuation of those non-ambulatory passengers. And boy, practice that one because it is challenging. Even a person who is not particularly large can be tough to get off the vehicle without giving them a lot of bumps and bruises. And the more you practice this, the better at it you're going to be. Doing proper vehicle evacuation is a training unto itself, so I guess I'll just leave it at that. But it's a really important consideration, a really important concern.
Is there any section on drunk passengers?
This training module doesn't specifically address the notion of intoxicated passengers. That is, it does, but it doesn't go in great depth there. I think looking at that other national RTAP module, difficult passengers, challenging situations, or problem passengers, challenging situations, there's a little more depth in that.
Okay. Can you keep passengers on the bus if they refuse to stay in an emergency?
Well, every person's going to do what they're going to do, and what we recommend in emergency procedures is do not evacuate the only time you want to evacuate your vehicle is when remaining on the vehicle is going to present a greater danger than leaving the vehicle. So the driver needs to really be able to do that good assessment and say, okay, am I safer here where we have a controlled environment, or are we at risk here because we may get plowed into from behind, or there are other sorts of risks. If somebody's going to get off your vehicle, people are going to do what they're going to do. I guess I wouldn't recommend that our drivers tackle people and strap them down in the chairs, but I think that our job as drivers is really to provide good leadership for our passengers in these emergency situations. And my experience on a wide variety of emergencies, working for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, working for my local fire department, working for the Forest Service as a fire information officers, people look to that. When they're in an emergency situation, they look to the person who knows what they're doing and acts like they're in control. So that's what this training module is really about, is helping our drivers have that confidence.
We have more of a comment. It says, we have actually worked with our local EMS and fire marshals, set up actual scenarios using smoke machines, passengers with injuries, and blocked exits. It has been very useful, and drivers have really taken a lot from it.
There you go.
I do not have a question, but a comment. I am tickled to see that this being put out there. I'm a manager of Bloomfield Transit, a fireman, and first responder. I encourage anyone out there to learn as much as you can to stay safe and help others do the same. To keep communication with all of your employees. This has been great. Just kind of going down through the list here. I don't want to miss anybody. Excellent training tool. We plan to present this training at our annual Safety Training Day in modules in April. We'll be able to train all 75 employees at the same time. Great product. Will you be presenting a START webinar?
And I guess that would be a question, National RTAP, that we'll have to assess and get back with you on that.
Sounds great. Again, another question for National RTAP. I don't have the answer, maybe Rob. When is the training seminar in Boston?
I'm sorry, Frank. I think Gary actually said Austin.
Oh,
Texas.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's in Austin, Texas, on the 28th of February as part of the Southwest Transit Association Annual Conference.
Okay.
And Frank, to answer that one about START, we certainly could do a webinar on the START module. What we'll do, we certainly have the person's information that asked that question, as well as everybody else that's participated in the webinar, and we can send out an announcement about START. There are a number of webinars that National RTAP does almost every month these days. But
okay. Can you make copies of this driver's book if we need extra? You can surely order as many as you want from us. I don't think there's a problem with making copies if they need to. So you mentioned it. Go ahead, Rob.
That's right. They can make copies, but we can certainly send them copies as well.
You mentioned a presidential order for drivers. Can you elaborate a little?
I certainly can. This is about the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System, NIMS and ICS. NIMS and ICS developed out of the state of California really in the Oakland Hills fires, when the state senator sat there with fire personnel and watched his multi-million-dollar home burn to the ground because they didn't have interoperability. They couldn't connect to the fire hoses. There are other fire trucks just yards away who had the right equipment, but they didn't have interoperability in their radio equipment. They all have different management systems, and things didn't go so well. So after that, and after when the space shuttle fell out of the sky and first responders got there and were using ICS, but then NASA came in and they had a different management system, there was a presidential directive saying, we will have one system for how we manage emergencies in this country, and it's going to be the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System. HSPD 5 is the order, and it says that any agency who might serve as an emergency responder needs to have this training, and it's at a 100 level for frontline staff, at a 200 level for middle managers, and at a 400 level for executive managers. Transit is coming to a dawning about, oh, I guess this means us also, and they're for the NIM 700, the IS 100 or the ICS 100 and 200. Those are all online courses, so available at training.fema.gov. For the 300 and 400 level course, you have to do those in person, and those are a lot more about resource tracking and information tracking. So if it's a really big bad disaster, you might actually get reimbursed if there's been a presidential disaster declaration. A lot more information at training.fema.gov.
Here's another one for you, Gary. Why are seatbelts not required to be used on public transit? Need to eliminate medical bills caused by public falling out of seats.
This argument has been out there for a long period of time. There's a lot of questions about that, and I guess you'd have to go to the NTSB for that answer.
Okay. For security purposes, should the rear emergency exit door be locked from the outside during operation to prevent unwanted entry?
I think that would be an agency-by-agency determination. You know, one of the hazards of that is if you're in an accident situation and people in the vehicle aren't able to activate that door from the inside and first responders are trying to get in from the outside, that may hamper their ability to do so. But I certainly hear the point of the comment that it also allows unwanted entry during normal operations.
And the last question I have is, what is START?
What is what?
What is the START module?
Oh, Safety Training in Rural Transit. And it's a training module released by National RTAP a couple of years ago, and it deals with 3 issues. Vehicle safety, so how do you do a proper pre-trip inspection? Driver safety, so what is defensive driving and how do you do that? And passenger safety, which covers everything from where do you pull up relative to the curb so people aren't stretching too far and injuring themselves getting on and off, to how do you properly utilize your wheelchair securement devices or mobility securement devices and so forth. So it's a great training module about how do you do vehicle, driver, and passenger safety on a day-to-day basis. And the distinction between START and this module, START is about normal operations. Emergency procedures are about, okay, what now? Things haven't gone the way that we wanted to in terms of safety. How do we respond?
Gary, that's all the questions I have in our queue.
Well, with that, I guess we're at 1 hour for this webinar along with the questions.